Grace had always loved the smell of old wood and the way light filtered through the tall windows of the concert hall. For 3 years now, she'd been coming here 5 days a week, arriving before sunrise when the building was still quiet and empty. Her job was simple. She tuned the pianos. That was it. No spotlight, no applause, just her, the instruments, and the early morning silence. The Riverside Concert Hall was one of those places that made you feel small in the best way possible. High ceilings, velvet seats in deep red, and a stage that had hosted some of the greatest musicians in the world. Grace had watched them all from the wings. She'd seen pianists who could make the whole room hold its breath, violinists who seemed to pull emotions right out of the air, and every single time she'd felt that same ache in her chest. The ache of wanting something you think you can't have. She didn't complain, though. Piano tuning was a good job. It paid her bills. It let her be close to music even if she wasn't making it herself. And honestly, most days she was grateful just to be there. She'd grown up in a small apartment where the walls were thin and money was tight. Piano lessons had been out of the question back then. Too expensive, too impractical. Her parents had worked double shifts just to keep food on the table. Music felt like a luxury for other people's children, but Grace had never stopped wanting it. She'd taught herself to read music from library books. She'd practiced on a cheap keyboard she'd bought at a yard sale when she was 16, and when she finally saved enough money to take real lessons as an adult, she'd walked into that first class with her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Now, at 28 years old, she was still taking lessons. Once a week, every Tuesday evening, she'd go to the small studio apartment of Mrs. Chen, a retired music professor who'd played in orchestras across 3 continents before arthritis forced her to stop. Mrs. Chen never made Grace feel silly for starting so late. She never talked about wasted potential or missed opportunities. She just taught, and Grace just learned. The thing was, nobody at the concert hall knew about any of this. To them, Grace was just the tuner, the quiet woman who came in early, did her work, and left before the real musicians arrived. She liked it that way. It was easier. Less pressure. Less chance of disappointment. Vincent Holloway, the concert hall's director, was a different story altogether. He'd been running the place for almost a decade, and he ran it like a well-oiled machine. Everything had to be perfect. Every performance had to be flawless. He was the kind of man who wore expensive suits and checked his watch constantly, always rushing to the next meeting, the next phone call, the next crisis. Grace had maybe spoken to him directly 5 times in 3 years, and those conversations had been brief, professional, cold even. He'd never asked her name, never asked how she was doing. To Vincent, she was part of the building's infrastructure, like the heating system or the stage lights, necessary but not worth noticing. She didn't take it personally. That's just how some people were, and honestly, she preferred being invisible. It meant she could work in peace. On that particular Tuesday afternoon, Grace was running late. Her morning lesson with Mrs. Chen had gone longer than usual. They'd been working on a particularly challenging piece, and Mrs. Chen had insisted they keep going until Grace got it right. By the time Grace arrived at the concert hall, it was already 2 in the afternoon. The building wasn't empty anymore. Staff members were moving around, preparing for evening rehearsals. But the main performance hall was still quiet. Grace made her way to the grand piano on stage. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway that had been custom-made for the hall 30 years ago. She ran her fingers along its glossy black surface before opening it up and getting to work. Tuning a piano wasn't quick. It required patience, a good ear, and steady hands. She worked methodically, adjusting tensions, checking octaves, making sure every note rang true. An hour later, she was done. The piano was perfect, but instead of packing up her tools and leaving like she normally did, Grace found herself sitting down on the bench. The hall was so quiet, so peaceful. Her fingers touched the keys almost without thinking, and then she started to play. It was the piece she'd been practicing with Mrs. Chen. A beautiful, flowing melody that required both technical skill and emotional depth. Grace had been working on it for months. It still wasn't perfect. She still made mistakes, but it was getting better. And right now, in this empty hall with nobody watching, she let herself get lost in it. The music filled the space around her. Her eyes closed. Her shoulders relaxed. For those few minutes, she wasn't the piano tuner. She was just a musician, playing in a concert hall, feeling the music move through her hands and out into the world. She didn't hear the door open, didn't hear the footsteps, didn't know anyone was there until she heard it, a laugh. Not a polite chuckle or a surprised gasp. A full, loud laugh that echoed through the hall. Grace's hands froze on the keys. Her eyes snapped open. Vincent Holloway stood in the aisle about halfway to the stage, his hand over his mouth but still visibly amused. Two other staff members stood behind him, looking uncomfortable. Grace felt her face go hot. She stood up quickly, nearly knocking over the piano bench. Her hands were shaking as she started gathering her tuning tools. Vincent walked closer, still smiling in that way that made Grace's stomach twist. "You play piano?" he said, and there was something in his tone that made it clear he found the whole thing hilarious. "I didn't know that was part of your job description." Grace didn't know what to say. She mumbled something about just checking the tuning, about making sure everything sounded right. But the words came out jumbled and unconvincing. Right, Vincent said, waving his hand dismissively. "Well, how about we leave the performing to the performers, yeah? I'm sure you're very good at tuning. Let's stick with that." One of the staff members behind him let out a nervous laugh. The other one looked at the floor. Grace nodded, her throat tight. She finished packing up her tools as quickly as possible, not looking at anyone. Vincent had already lost interest, pulling out his phone to check something. He was talking to the other staff members now about scheduling, about some problem with ticket sales, about anything other than the embarrassing moment that had just happened. Grace left through the side door, her toolbox heavy in her hand. The afternoon sun was too bright after the dim lighting of the hall. She walked to her car and sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine. Her hands were still shaking, not from fear or anger, but from something else. Something that felt like humiliation mixed with determination. That laugh kept echoing in her head. That dismissive wave of Vincent's hand. The assumption that she couldn't possibly be good enough to perform on that stage. Grace drove home with her jaw clenched and her mind racing. And somewhere between the concert hall and her tiny apartment, something shifted inside her. Something hard and stubborn and fierce. She'd been playing it safe for so long, being invisible, not making waves, accepting her place. Maybe it was time to change that. Grace thought maybe it would blow over, that by the next morning, Vincent would have forgotten all about it, that the whole embarrassing incident would just fade away like it never happened. She was wrong. She arrived at work the next day at her usual time, just before 6 in the morning. The building was quiet the way she liked it. She went straight to the smaller rehearsal hall on the second floor, where there were 3 upright pianos that needed attention. She was halfway through tuning the first one when she heard voices in the hallway. 2 of the staff coordinators were walking past, their voices carrying through the open door. Grace recognized them both. Lisa and Patrick. They'd always been friendly enough, giving her quick smiles when they passed each other in the halls. "I still can't believe it," Lisa was saying, and there was laughter in her voice. "Vincent told me yesterday. The piano tuner was actually sitting there playing. Like she thought she was preparing for a concert or something." Patrick laughed. "What did he say exactly?" "He said it was like watching someone who learned piano from YouTube videos. You know, technically hitting the right notes but with absolutely no soul. No understanding of what the music actually means." Grace's hands froze on the piano strings. Her stomach dropped. "That's harsh," Patrick said, but he was still laughing. "Well, you know Vincent. He doesn't sugarcoat things." He said he had to tell her to stick to her day job. "I mean, can you imagine? Working here around all these incredible musicians and thinking you could just sit down and play like that's your stage?" Their voices faded as they walked away, but the damage was done. Grace sat there staring at her hands. Vincent hadn't just laughed at her in the moment. He'd turned it into a story, an anecdote to share with the staff, entertainment for their morning coffee break. The worst part was what Lisa had said about having no soul, no understanding of the music. Those words dug into Grace deeper than anything else. Because what if it was true? What if she'd been fooling herself all along? What if all those hours of practice, all those lessons with Mrs. Chen, all that hope she'd been carrying around was just delusion? The next few days were torture. Grace started noticing the looks, the whispered conversations that stopped when she walked into a room, the barely concealed smiles. It wasn't everyone. Most of the staff probably didn't even know or care. But enough people knew that Grace felt exposed everywhere she went in that building. On Thursday, she was in the main hall adjusting the concert grand, When 3 of the professional musicians came in for their afternoon rehearsal, they were violinists, part of the hall's resident quartet. Grace recognized them immediately. These were people who'd performed in famous venues across the country. People who'd dedicated their entire lives to music. She kept her head down, working quickly, hoping to finish before they really noticed her. But as she was packing up her tools, she heard one of them speaking in a voice just loud enough to carry. "Is that her? The one Vincent was talking about?" "I think so. The tuner. Oh my God. That's actually kind of sad. Like, I feel bad for her, you know? Imagine thinking you're good enough to play here." Grace's face burned. She grabbed her toolbox and walked out as fast as she could without running. Behind her, she heard someone say, "Oops, I think she heard us." And then more quiet laughter. She made it to the women's restroom before the tears started. She locked herself in a stall and just stood there, crying as quietly as she could, one hand pressed against her mouth. This was humiliation in its purest form. Not just being laughed at once, but knowing that she'd become a joke. A story people told each other. The delusional piano tuner who didn't know her place. For a moment, sitting there in that bathroom stall, Grace considered quitting. Just walking away from the whole thing, finding another job where nobody knew about this, starting over somewhere else. It would be easier. It would hurt less. But then something else rose up inside her, something stubborn and angry and fierce. Why should she quit? She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd played a piano. That was it. She hadn't claimed to be a professional. She hadn't demanded anything from anyone. She'd just been playing music in what she thought was an empty room. And the truth was, she knew she wasn't bad. Not really. She had limitations, sure. She'd started late. She didn't have the training that people who'd gone to conservatories had. But Mrs. Chen wouldn't keep teaching her if she had no talent. Mrs. Chen was too honest for that. Too direct. If Grace had been hopeless, Mrs. Chen would have told her years ago. Grace wiped her eyes. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. Her face was blotchy and her eyes were red, but there was something else there too, a determination she hadn't felt before. She'd spent so much of her life being quiet, being invisible, not asking for too much, not taking up too much space. And where had that gotten her? She was still invisible, but now she was also a joke. That evening, instead of going home after work, Grace drove straight to Mrs. Chen's apartment. It wasn't their usual lesson day, but she needed to talk to someone. Mrs. Chen answered the door with her usual warm smile, took one look at Grace's face and immediately put the kettle on for tea. Grace told her everything. About getting caught playing, about Vincent's reaction, about becoming the subject of gossip and laughter, about feeling like maybe she'd been fooling herself all along. The words poured out of her and Mrs. Chen just listened, her weathered hands wrapped around her own teacup. When Grace finally finished, Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you know why I keep teaching you, Grace?" Grace shook her head. "Because you have something that many technically perfect musicians lack. You have genuine love for the music. I hear it when you play. And yes, you have limitations, we all do, but you also have potential that hasn't been fully realized yet. The question is not whether you're good enough. The question is whether you're willing to work hard enough to prove it, to yourself, not to them. But what if I can't?" Grace asked. "What if I practice for years and I'm still not good enough to be taken seriously?" Mrs. Chen smiled. "Then at least you'll know you tried." "But Grace, I've been teaching music for 45 years. I can tell you right now that you're capable of more than you think. Much more. The real question is whether you're going to let a man who knows nothing about your journey decide your worth." Grace went home that night and did something she'd never done before. She cleared space in her tiny living room and moved her keyboard into the center. She'd always practiced quietly before, worried about disturbing neighbors. But tonight she didn't care. She put on her headphones, pulled out the most challenging pieces Mrs. Chen had ever given her, and she played. She played until her fingers ached. Until her back hurt from sitting. Until she made the same mistake 20 times and finally got it right on the 21st try. And when she finished hours later, she didn't feel humiliated anymore. She felt angry. But it was the good kind of angry, the kind that pushes you forward instead of pulling you down. If Vincent and the others wanted to laugh at her, fine. Let them laugh. But she was going to practice. She was going to improve. She was going to work harder than she'd ever worked before. Not because she wanted to prove anything to them, but because she wanted to prove something to herself, that somewhere inside her, beyond the late start and the lack of formal training and the self-doubt, there was a real musician trying to get out. And she was finally ready to let her. 6 months passed like a blur. Grace fell into a routine that would have seemed crazy to her old self. She'd wake up at 4 a.m. and practice for an hour before work. Then she'd go to the concert hall, do her tuning job, come home, and practice for another 3 hours. Every single day, even weekends, especially weekends. Her fingers developed calluses. Her back ached constantly from sitting at the keyboard. Her neighbors probably hated her, though they were too polite to say anything. But Grace didn't care. She was obsessed. Not in an unhealthy way. In a focused way. In a "this is what I want and I'm going to get it" way. Mrs. Chen had doubled their lesson time. Instead of once a week, they were meeting 3 times a week. And Mrs. Chen wasn't going easy on her. She pushed Grace harder than ever before, demanding precision, demanding emotion, demanding everything she had and then some. There were nights when Grace left those lessons feeling completely defeated. But she always came back. The gossip at work had mostly died down. People had moved on to other stories, other dramas. Grace was invisible again, which suited her just fine. She did her job efficiently and professionally. She spoke to Vincent only when necessary, keeping their interactions brief and cold. If he noticed the change in her, he didn't mention it. She suspected he'd already forgotten about the whole incident. To him, it had been nothing, a funny moment in his day. He had no idea what he'd started. Grace had a new goal now. The concert hall held an annual winter gala every December. It was the biggest event of the year. Important people attended, music critics from major newspapers, donors who funded the hall, local celebrities. It was always sold out months in advance, and the performances were always world-class. Grace had watched the gala from the wings for the past 3 years. This year, she had a different kind of dream. Not about watching, about playing. She knew it was impossible. The performers were always established professionals with impressive resumes, but having an impossible dream gave her something to practice toward, something to push for. December came faster than expected. The concert hall was buzzing with preparation. This year's gala was especially important because they'd managed to book Catherine Morrison, a pianist who'd performed at Carnegie Hall and won international competitions. She was the kind of musician people paid hundreds of dollars to see. Tickets had sold out in less than 2 hours. Grace had tuned the concert grand piano 4 times in the week leading up to the gala. Vincent wanted everything perfect. The pressure was on everyone. Staff members rushed around with clipboards and stressed expressions. The lighting crew ran through their cues over and over. Even the ushers were practicing their crowd management procedures. The gala was scheduled for December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas. Grace had the day off, but she'd been asked to come in that morning for one final piano check. She agreed, like always. She arrived at the concert hall at 9 in the morning, toolbox in hand. The place was chaos, but it was organized chaos. Everyone knew their role. Everyone was focused. Grace made her way to the stage and spent an hour with the piano, checking every detail, making tiny adjustments that probably no one but her would notice. When she finished, the piano was perfect. Absolutely perfect. She felt a strange sense of pride knowing that Catherine Morrison would be playing this instrument tonight. At least Grace had that connection to the performance. She was packing up her tools when she heard shouting from the backstage area. Angry voices, panicked voices. Grace froze, listening. She recognized Vincent's voice immediately. He sounded desperate. "What do you mean she's not coming? What do you mean?" Grace slowly walked toward the commotion. A small crowd had gathered backstage. Staff members, coordinators, the lighting director, everyone looked stricken. Vincent was on his phone, his face red, his free hand gripping his hair like he might pull it out. "I don't care if she has the flu," Vincent was saying into the phone. "I don't care if she has pneumonia. We have 500 people showing up here in 9 hours. 9 hours, we need a pianist." Grace's heart started pounding. Catherine Morrison wasn't coming. The star of the show, the reason people had bought tickets. She wasn't coming. Vincent hung up the phone and immediately dialed another number. Grace watched as he made call after call, increasingly frantic, begging every professional pianist he knew to step in. But it was 2 days before Christmas. Everyone was either already booked for other performances or had left town to spend the holidays with family. Call after call, the answer was the same. No. Sorry. Can't do it. Impossible. An hour passed. Then 2. Vincent was pacing now, his expensive suit rumpled, his tie loosened. The staff members stood around looking helpless. Someone suggested canceling the event. Vincent actually yelled at them. Canceling wasn't an option. The donors were coming, the critics were coming, the mayor was coming. This was the concert hall's biggest fundraiser of the year. They couldn't cancel. Grace stood in the corner unnoticed as usual. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. She was thinking something crazy, something absolutely insane. But she couldn't stop thinking it. The thought grew, louder and louder in her mind until it was drowning out everything else. She could do it. She could play. She'd been practicing Catherine Morrison's exact program for months. Not because she thought she'd ever perform it, but because it was challenging and beautiful, and exactly the kind of music she wanted to master. She knew every note, every dynamic, every emotional shift. She'd played it hundreds of times. But could she really offer? Could she really walk up to Vincent, the man who'd laughed at her playing, who'd made her a joke, and suggest that she perform at the most important event of the year? The rational part of her brain said absolutely not. It was humiliating. It was setting herself up for rejection. It was professional suicide. But another part of her brain, the part that had been practicing 4 hours a day for 6 months, the part that Mrs. Chen had been nurturing and pushing, that part said yes. Say something. Offer. What's the worst that could happen? He'd already humiliated you once. You survived it. You got stronger. Grace took a deep breath. Her hands were shaking. She walked over to where Vincent was standing, now scrolling desperately through his phone contacts, looking for anyone he might have missed. "Excuse me," Grace said quietly. Vincent didn't even look up. "Not now, I'm busy." "I know," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know you need a pianist." "Yes. Thank you for that brilliant observation," Vincent snapped. "Unless you can magically produce one in the next 7 hours, I don't need your input right now." Grace swallowed hard. This was it. The moment. She could walk away right now and nobody would blame her. Or she could jump. "I can play it," she said. The words hung in the air. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Vincent slowly looked up from his phone. He stared at Grace like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "What did you just say?" "I can play Catherine Morrison's program. I know it. All of it. I've been practicing it for months." Vincent's expression shifted from confusion to recognition, to something that looked almost like anger. "You? You're joking. Tell me you're joking right now." "I'm not joking. I can do it." Someone in the background laughed nervously. Vincent shook his head, his jaw tight. "Absolutely not. No, not happening. I'd rather cancel the entire event than—" "Have you embarrassed this concert hall in front of 500 people? Grace felt like she'd been slapped. But she'd expected this. She'd prepared for this. "Then cancel it," she said quietly. "But you said you can't. You said canceling isn't an option. So what other choice do you have?" Vincent looked around at the gathered staff members, as if hoping someone would provide a better solution, but everyone just stared back at him helpless. The truth was obvious. He had no other options. It was either let Grace try, or cancel the event and face the consequences. He looked at his watch, then back at Grace. And for a moment she saw something in his eyes that might have been desperation, or maybe resignation. "If you mess this up," he said slowly, "if you embarrass this hall, you're done. Do you understand?" "Done." Grace nodded. She understood perfectly. This was her one chance. Her only chance. And she was ready to take it. The next 7 hours felt like 7 minutes and 7 years at the same time. Grace went home to shower and change, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her car keys. She stood in front of her closet for 15 minutes staring at her clothes. She didn't own anything fancy. Nothing appropriate for performing at a gala where people wore evening gowns and tuxedos. Finally, she called Mrs. Chen. Her teacher arrived at her apartment 30 minutes later with a simple black dress borrowed from her daughter. It was elegant but understated. Perfect. Mrs. Chen helped Grace with her hair, pulling it back into a neat bun. Then she held both of Grace's hands and looked her straight in the eyes. "You are ready for this," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "I would not let you walk onto that stage if you weren't. Do you believe me?" Grace nodded, though truthfully she wasn't sure what she believed anymore. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching herself from outside her own body. "The nerves are good," Mrs. Chen continued. "They mean you care. But once you sit down at that piano, once your fingers touch those keys, let everything else fall away. It's just you and the music, that's all that matters." Grace arrived back at the concert hall at 6:30. The performance started at 7. The building had transformed. The lobby glittered with lights and decorations. Well-dressed people were already arriving, handed programs by smiling ushers. Through the open doors, Grace could see the main hall filling with the city's elite. Women in sparkling dresses, men in tailored suits. Everyone talking and laughing, expecting an incredible evening. None of them knew that Catherine Morrison wasn't coming. Vincent had made the decision not to announce it beforehand. He'd simply had the programs reprinted with Grace's name instead. He'd told Grace this information in a tone that made it clear he thought it was a terrible idea, and that she'd better not make him regret it. Grace stood backstage, breathing slowly, trying to calm her racing heart. She could hear the audience settling into their seats. The low murmur of hundreds of conversations. Someone laughed loudly. Someone else clinked glasses. These people had paid a lot of money to be here tonight. They were expecting a world-class performance. A stagehand gave her the 5-minute warning. Grace closed her eyes. She thought about all those early mornings, all those late nights, every single hour she'd spent practicing, her fingers moving over the keys again and again and again. She thought about Mrs. Chen's patient corrections, her encouragement, her belief. She thought about that day 6 months ago when Vincent had laughed at her, when she'd felt small and embarrassed and worthless. She wasn't that person anymore. The lights in the auditorium dimmed. The audience noise faded to silence. Vincent walked onto the stage to introduce the performance. Grace could hear him from where she stood in the wings, but she couldn't make out the words. Her heart was pounding too loudly. Then Vincent was walking off stage, passing right by her. He didn't look at her, didn't say good luck, didn't say anything. He just walked past like she wasn't there. The stagehand touched her shoulder gently. "You're on." Grace walked onto the stage. The spotlight hit her immediately, bright and warm. The audience was a sea of shadowy faces beyond the light. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her. She heard whispers, confusion. This wasn't Catherine Morrison. Who was this woman? Where was the famous pianist they'd come to see? Grace walked to the piano, her borrowed dress swishing softly. The stage felt enormous. The piano looked simultaneously familiar and terrifying. She sat down on the bench, adjusting it slightly. Her hands were trembling as she placed them on the keys. For one horrible moment, her mind went completely blank. She couldn't remember the first note. Couldn't remember anything. Panic started to rise in her chest. The silence stretched on. People were definitely whispering now. She could hear the confusion spreading through the audience. Then, like a gift, she heard Mrs. Chen's voice in her memory. "It's just you and the music." Grace took a breath. She let her fingers rest on the keys. And then she began to play. The first notes came out tentatively. Too soft, she could feel it. She could hear the uncertainty in her own playing. This was what Vincent had been afraid of. This was why he hadn't wanted her here. She was freezing, choking, proving him right. But then something shifted. Maybe it was muscle memory. Maybe it was all those months of practice taking over when her conscious mind was too scared to function. Her fingers found their rhythm. The notes began to flow. She stopped thinking about the audience, stopped thinking about Vincent, stopped thinking about anything except the music. The piece she was playing was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was one of the most beautiful and technically demanding pieces ever written. The kind of music that could make you cry or give you chills or both at the same time. Grace had listened to dozens of recordings of different pianists playing it. She'd studied every interpretation, and she'd practiced it until she could play it in her sleep. Now, on this stage, with everything on the line, the music poured out of her. Her hands moved across the keys with a confidence that surprised even her. The melody soared and dipped, powerful and delicate by turns. She felt the emotion of it in her chest, in her throat. This was why she loved music. This feeling. This connection between her soul and the sound filling the space around her. The audience had gone completely quiet. No more whispers. No more confusion. They were listening. Really listening. Then came the moment. Halfway through the first movement, there was a particular passage that Grace had always found transcendent. It built and built, the intensity growing, and then it released into a single high note. A crystalline, pure note that had to be held just right. Too short and it lost its impact. Too long and it became showy. It had to be perfect. Grace reached that moment. Her right hand lifted, her finger poised above the key, and then she struck it. The note rang out through the concert hall, clear and bright and absolutely perfect. She held it, letting it resonate, feeling the vibration through her whole body, and in that moment something magical happened. The entire atmosphere in the hall shifted. It was like everyone in that audience took a collective breath and leaned forward at the same time. Grace felt it. She felt the connection lock into place. They weren't skeptical anymore. They weren't confused. They were with her. She had them. She continued playing with a freedom she'd never experienced before. Every note felt right. Every dynamic, every pause, every crescendo flowed naturally. Her hands knew what to do. Her heart knew what to feel. This was what Mrs. Chen had been trying to teach her. This was what all those hours of practice had been for. Not just to hit the right notes, but to truly become one with the music. The piece had several movements, and Grace played through all of them without faltering. There were technically challenging passages that she navigated with precision. There were emotional moments that she poured herself into, and through it all the audience stayed with her, completely captivated. When she finally played the last chord, when the final note faded into silence, Grace lifted her hands from the keys and just sat there for a moment, exhausted, exhilarated, not quite believing what had just happened. The silence held for one heartbeat, 2, 3. Then, the applause started. And it wasn't polite applause. It wasn't the kind of applause you give because you're supposed to. It was thunderous. People were rising to their feet. The entire audience, all 500 of them, standing and clapping and cheering. Grace stood up on shaky legs and turned to face them. The spotlight was still on her, but now she could see faces in the front rows. People were smiling. Some were wiping their eyes. A woman in the third row was openly crying, still clapping enthusiastically. Grace bowed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. The applause continued, and continued. People weren't sitting back down. They just kept clapping. Some were whistling. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" From the wings, Grace caught sight of Vincent. He was standing there, frozen, his mouth slightly open. He looked shocked, absolutely stunned. Their eyes met for just a second, and Grace saw something in his expression that might have been regret. Or maybe shame. Or maybe just disbelief. Grace bowed again and walked off the stage, her legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. The applause followed her into the wings. Even after she disappeared from view, she could still hear it, waves of sound washing over her. Mrs. Chen was waiting backstage, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed Grace and hugged her tightly, saying nothing, because no words were necessary. They both knew what had just happened. Grace hadn't just performed. She'd proven something. To Vincent, to the audience, but most importantly to herself. Grace sat in a small dressing room backstage, still wearing the borrowed black dress, still trying to process what had just happened. Her hands were shaking, but not from nerves anymore. From adrenaline, from disbelief, from pure joy. Mrs. Chen sat beside her, holding a cup of water that Grace kept forgetting to drink. There was a knock at the door, then another, and another. Staff members kept poking their heads in, offering congratulations, their faces showing genuine amazement. These were the same people who'd gossiped about her 6 months ago. The same people who'd thought she was delusional for even touching a piano. Now they were looking at her differently, like they were seeing her for the first time. The door opened again, and this time it was Vincent. He stood in the doorway, his expensive suit somehow looking rumpled despite being perfectly pressed. His face was hard to read. Grace felt her stomach tighten. Even after the standing ovation, even after proving herself, part of her still expected him to find something to criticize. Mrs. Chen stood up, gave Grace's shoulder a squeeze, and quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. Grace and Vincent were alone. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. "I was wrong," Vincent finally said. His voice was quiet, not the loud, confident tone he usually used. "I was completely wrong about you, and I'm sorry." Grace hadn't expected an apology. She'd expected a lot of things, but not that. She didn't know what to say. Vincent continued, running a hand through his hair. "I've been running this concert hall for 10 years. I thought I knew talent when I saw it. I thought I understood what it took to be a real musician, but I judged you based on your job title, based on assumptions. I didn't actually listen to you play. Not really, and that was wrong." "You listened tonight," Grace said softly. "Everyone listened tonight," Vincent replied. "Grace, what you did out there, that was extraordinary. Do you understand that? I've heard dozens of professional pianists play that piece, some of them technically perfect. But what you did, the emotion you brought to it, that was special. That was real." Grace felt tears starting in her eyes. She'd been holding it together, but Vincent's words, his genuine apology, it broke something open inside her. "I spent 6 months working," she said, her voice cracking. "Every single day, hours and hours, because I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't what you thought I was, that I wasn't a joke." Vincent looked down at his feet. "I know, and I'm sorry I made you feel that way. I'm sorry I created an environment where people felt comfortable mocking you. That's on me. That's my failure as a leader." He paused, then looked back up at her. "But what you proved tonight went beyond just showing me up. You proved that dedication and passion can create something beautiful. That's not common. That's rare." There was another knock on the door. A staff member poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but there are several people from the audience asking to meet her. And there are 2 music critics waiting in the lobby who want to do interviews." Grace's eyes widened. Music critics. The actual professional critics who reviewed performances for newspapers, who could make or break a career with their words. Vincent looked at Grace. "It's up to you. You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. But I will say, what happened tonight, this isn't going to stay quiet. By tomorrow morning, people are going to be talking about this performance. You should be prepared for that." Grace took a shaky breath. "Okay, I'll talk to them." The next hour was a blur. Grace met with 2 critics who asked her questions about her background, her training, how long she'd been playing. She told them the truth. About starting late, about Mrs. Chen, about working as a piano tuner while pursuing her passion on the side, about the 6 months of intensive practice. She didn't mention Vincent's initial reaction, didn't mention the humiliation. That wasn't the story she wanted to tell. The critics were both clearly impressed. One of them, an older man who'd been reviewing classical music for 30 years, told Grace that hers was one of the most moving performances he'd witnessed in the past decade. He said he'd be writing about it, that he wanted to follow her career. After the critics left, Grace met with several audience members who'd waited around just to congratulate her. A wealthy donor offered to fund future performances. A music teacher from a local university asked if she'd ever considered teaching. Person after person told her how the performance had moved them, how they'd never heard that piece played quite that way before. By the time Grace finally left the concert hall, it was almost midnight. Mrs. Chen drove her home, both of them too emotionally exhausted to talk much. When Grace finally collapsed into her own bed, still in the borrowed dress, she couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying the evening. The performance. The applause. Vincent's apology. The critics. All of it felt like a dream. The next morning, Grace woke up to 47 text messages and 12 missed calls. She scrolled through them, bewildered. Friends she hadn't talked to in months. Former coworkers. People she barely knew. All of them had seen something. She opened her laptop and searched her own name. There it was. Articles, reviews, social media posts. Unknown piano tuner delivers performance of a lifetime. Local woman steps in last minute. Stuns gala audience. The piano tuner who could. How Grace's journey proves passion trumps pedigree. The reviews were glowing. The older critic had written a lengthy piece about how classical music sometimes got too caught up in credentials and conservatory training, and how Grace's performance was a reminder that real artistry came from somewhere deeper. He praised her technical skill but focused more on the emotional authenticity she'd brought to the music. Grace's phone rang. It was Vincent. "Have you seen the coverage?" he asked. "I'm looking at it now," Grace said, still scrolling in disbelief. "I have 5 calls this morning from venues wanting to book you. 3 from event organizers, 1 from a recording studio. Grace, this is real. This isn't going away." Grace sat down heavily on her couch. "I don't know what to do with this." "You don't have to decide right now," Vincent said. "But I want you to know your job at the concert hall, it's yours for as long as you want it. But also, if you want to transition to performing, I'll help you. I'll connect you with people. I'll support whatever you choose." Over the next few weeks, Grace's life changed in ways she never could have imagined. She was invited to perform at 2 other venues, both smaller than the gala, but still legitimate performances with real audiences. She said yes to both. Mrs. Chen helped her prepare, and both performances went beautifully. But here's what surprised Grace the most. Despite the opportunities, despite the recognition, she didn't quit her job as a piano tuner. She didn't abandon the work that had brought her to that concert hall in the first place. Instead, she found a balance. She tuned pianos 3 days a week and performed on the weekends. She took on students teaching piano to people who, like her, had started late or thought they'd missed their chance. The concert hall became a different place for her. The staff who'd once gossiped about her now treated her with respect. Some even asked her for advice on their own dreams and ambitions. Vincent became not just her employer, but something like a mentor, introducing her to musicians and helping her navigate the professional music world. But the most important change was internal. Grace no longer felt like she had to prove anything to anyone. That desperate need for validation that had driven her during those 6 months of intense practice, it had transformed into something healthier, a pure love for the music itself, a confidence that came from within rather than from other people's approval. 1 year later, almost to the day, Grace performed at the concert hall again. This time she wasn't filling in for someone else. This time her name was on the marquee from the beginning, and as she walked onto that stage, as she sat down at the piano she'd tuned earlier that morning, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about that afternoon when Vincent had laughed at her playing. How humiliated she'd felt. How small. And she realized something profound. That moment, as painful as it had been a gift. It had forced her to choose. To decide whether she'd let someone else's judgment define her, or whether she'd define herself. She'd chosen herself. And that had made all the difference. Grace placed her hands on the keys, smiled at the audience full of people who'd come specifically to hear her play, and began. The music filled the hall, beautiful and true. And in that moment, Grace wasn't a piano tuner who happened to play. She wasn't someone who'd gotten lucky with one good performance. She was simply a musician, sharing something she loved with people who wanted to listen. And that perfect note, the one that had changed everything, it wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a reminder that inside every person, there's something extraordinary waiting to emerge. Sometimes it just takes one moment, one chance, one decision to let it out. For Grace, that moment had come when someone laughed at her dream. And instead of letting it crush her, she'd let it fuel her. She'd turned humiliation into determination, doubt into dedication, and a single note into a new life.